Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Tranquility. We've got another edition of our Artist Retrospective, or what we call the History of. Today, as promised, we are going to talk about the legendary band from Birmingham, Black Sabbath. And, when I was kind of plotting this whole episode out, I said, I'd like to bring someone on board to help me out with this. Someone who is as big a Black Sabbath fan as I am. And there's only one person that came to mind. That's this guy right here, Chris Alo. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Pete, thanks so much for having me. I'm absolutely honored. When Pete asked me to do this, I was like, "Wow, that's awesome! I'm thrilled to be here."
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you've done.
A lifelong Black Sabbath fan. Started listening to them in the early '80s. Wound up, I have able to see them 41 times in concert.
Ooh,
I counted last night, and that includes shows in Holland, Belgium. I've seen them at the Hammersmith Odeon. I saw them 2 nights at the NEC Arena in Birmingham, England. It's not Birmingham.
Right.
They definitely get they get annoyed by that. I did college radio, and then I started writing for fanzines and then magazines. I've written for Circus, Pit, Metal Edge, Metal Maniacs, Roadie Crew magazine in South America, Zero Tolerance in England. I still write for Roadie Crew and More Sugar in New York. And as far as interviews goes, I've done a ton of Sabbath interviews. I've interviewed Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Ronnie James Dio, Vinny Appice, Glenn Hughes, Ian Gillan. I've done, Sabbath one-timers, Rob Halford, Burton C. Bell, Sully Erna from Godsmack, Shannon Larkin from Godsmack, and asked them all as many Sabbath-related questions as I could.
Gotta love it.
Yeah, I definitely consider myself a big Sabbath fan, and I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, I caught them. The coolest one in the last couple of years was literally the beginning of the end. Had opening night of the End Tour in Omaha, Nebraska. My buddy and I, Sean, flew out there, and we had front row tickets, and that was awesome. And I figured, well, now that they're ending it, rather than go to England for the end, and I was like, let me catch them when they're super fresh.
Right at the beginning.
And
the beginning of the end, right?
The beginning of the end, literally. So, so I do consider myself a big Sabbath fan, and this is an honor to be here and go over talk about my favorite band.
Yes, Chris and I know each other about 10 or 15 years.
Sure.
I have a bunch of mutual friends, but we're kind of in the journalist industry, so to speak, and we would always run into each other in photo pits at concerts or whatever like that. So again, Chris, thanks for joining us here. So Black Sabbath. So let's go way back in time. So 1968. So you got 4 guys from Birmingham.
Yeah.
Who doing all sorts of odd jobs, just out of school. Some of them still in school, working, at the steel mills and what have you. At
Birmingham
the slaughterhouse
was still a mess. Still it was. We recovered. They were still trying to recover all these years after World War II and
dark and dingy,
low income housing, and these guys were living, literally on the wrong side of the tracks, and music was the way out.
So most of them are playing in blues bands, right? But then all of a sudden, Tony Iommi on guitar gets introduced to John Ozzy Osbourne, and then Bill Ward comes into the picture, and then Terry Geezer Butler, and before you know it, they decide to form a band. Originally, there was I forget the name of the polka band or something like that. They had a much larger band,
Polka Toke Blues band.
Yes.
And if I remember right, Tony used to beat Ozzy up in school, and then wasn't it Ozzy put up an ad in a record store? Ozzy Zig requires gig, and they showed up at Tony's house, and he was like, "Oh no, it can't be the same Ozzy." And sure enough, it was, and history was made.
That's right. So they eventually decided to change their name, thankfully, and just kind of shore up the lineup to that 4 that we just mentioned and call themselves Earth, right? So they start, playing, rehearsing, and doing some local gigs and what have you. But then all of a sudden, Tony winds up accepting an offer to join Jethro Tull.
Right.
Okay, so Mick Abrams had just left Jethro Tull. They needed a replacement, so Tony got the gig. I think they only played 2 gigs. He only played 2 gigs with them. One was at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus.
Which thankfully somebody captured that on film.
On film,
which
yeah.
I don't think it was even released until the 80s, if I remember
If not
right.
later than that, yeah, exactly. So basically they played Song for Jeffrey on the show. And the funny thing is, Ian Anderson actually sang live at the recording of the event, but the rest of the band were just miming the song.
See, I didn't even know that.
But then they played one more show, I think for the BBC, and then Tony kind of decided that maybe that wasn't the right gig for him.
Right.
Went back, got back together with the guys from Earth. They were pretty happy to have him back, and they decided to change their name to Black Sabbath.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, the story was they went to the movies.
Yes.
And they saw Mario Bava's Black Sabbath film, and thank God for that.
That was that.
Yeah. Again, changes slight little things, changing history.
Yeah, exactly. So Black Sabbath is born. Shortly after that, Warner Brothers comes calling, right? And this is the debut album, 1969, right?
February 13th, 1970.
1970. Oh, yeah, recorded in 69,
yes,
right?
Recorded in 69, released.
Yeah. The end of the year, right?
Yeah.
It was right around the holidays.
Actually, yeah. I think the date on Wikipedia, who knows if it's right, was October 6th, 1969.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, recorded by Roger Bain, produced it, who produced the first 3 records.
Yeah. That iconic cover. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't get much more eerie than that. But of course, it's all about the song. So, this is music that the world had never heard before, basically. Heavy, I guess you can kind of call the roots of it blues rock, right?
Sure,
but
blues,
heavier,
jazz, just heavier than anything else out there.
Yeah, lots of distortion. They got the classic title track, right? Black Sabbath. You got The Wizard, Behind the Wall of Sleep, NIB, The Long, Sweet, Wicked World. I mean, it's just...
Right. I mean, as a kid too, I didn't realize that there was. I had the U.S. version. I didn't realize that.
Right? Yeah.
I didn't realize that the European version had Evil Woman.
Evil Woman. It's a cover tune.
Yeah, which is interesting to think. Okay, it's their debut album, but there's technically 2 covers.
Yeah.
Evil Woman and Warning. Evil Woman was from the band Crow. Mm-hmm. Right, and Warning from Ainsley Dunsbar.
Dunsbar's Retaliation, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
But, talk about, there's not a lot of, listen, I'm far from a music expert, but so I don't know if you can say, okay, this was the record that, launched country music. But, certainly, in my opinion, this is the record that launched heavy metal.
I have to agree with you. And probably one of the greatest debut albums of a rock band ever.
Absolutely.
In my opinion. I mean, this put them on the map. This started a whole wave that we're still feeling today. And, whether it's your favorite Sabbath album or not, you just can't deny what this brought to the table and the legacy that kind of created from there.
Yeah, I mean, the influence that thing had is amazing. And eventually was certified platinum in the U.S., but apparently that was in 1986, so I'm sure it sold many more copies since. One thing I learned recently was that Tom Allen, whose claim to fame was producing all the hits for Judas Priest and worked on the Firepower record, he was an engineer on the first Black Sabbath record.
Oh wow! Okay.
Which I had no idea.
I didn't know that either. Yeah.
That was a cool little thing I learned recently. But yeah, what a landmark album! One of my favorite Sabbath records. And it's a history-changing, landmark.
Yeah, absolutely. So not to kind of take anything away from that, so they returned not long afterwards. This back in the day when most bands would release 2 albums a year, sometimes more.
Which is crazy if you think about it now.
Oh, it doesn't happen anymore. No. It's back then it was album, tour, and it was just a relentless schedule, which is why most of those classic bands just really burnt themselves out after 5 or 10 years.
Absolutely, and what boggles my mind too, when you look back on the historic dates, how often the band would record the record and go on tour, even for some of the earlier Sabbath records, but the record didn't come out until the tour was over.
Yeah,
and I'm like, wait, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and a lot of these bands were playing some of the songs.
Yes.
Live before the albums even came out.
My favorite one is, not to get off the Sabbath subject, but I've seen a couple interviews where somebody would ask John Paul Jones, well, how did the audience react the first time you guys played Stairway to Heaven? He's like, the audience didn't react at all. They didn't know it. They wanted to hear a song they knew, like "Whole Lot of Love."
Yep.
So yeah, it's crazy how the industry has changed in recent years, but even to back then, it was quite different.
Yep. So, of course, next is this monster, Paranoid. This is actually my first Black Sabbath album. I actually bought the LP of this, the NEMS version.
Okay.
Remember the old NEMS,
Yep.
NEMS LP back in 1979.
Wow.
So I was 13 years old when this was my first introduction to Black Sabbath. And at the time, I was a pretty big Kiss fan. But Kiss was starting to get a little more commercial, a little more poppy. And then I got a hold of this. And basically, that changed my life forever. I mean, this was my introduction to much heavier music, although a lot of the Kiss stuff is pretty heavy. But I mean, this was a game changer for me. And now all these years later, I'm in my early 50s. It's like this is still a classic album because of course it has War Pigs and Paranoid and Iron Man and Planet Caravan, Hand of Doom.
Great. The entire record.
It's great.
Yeah.
However, because I've heard this album so many times over the years. Like at the end of the show, we're going to talk about our favorite Sabbath albums. This is not going to show up there. If you would ask me that question 30, 40 years ago,
right?
Different story. But a legendary album nonetheless, and this was the album that really broke Black Sabbath.
Absolutely.
Worldwide.
Just an amazing record. And also this was my first Black Sabbath record too. I know there's a big thing floating around the internet now about the top 10 records that influenced you or changed your life or whatever. For me, the number one record that changed my life was that. It was Paranoid. It was, I had, some records and I had Kiss Alive on 8-track before then. But to me, music was something that you just listened to in the background when you were cleaning your room or, you were driving around, whatever. This was the music that changed everything for me and made me a music fan. And again, it's such a landmark record. I'm sure most people know the story of, listen, I love Black Sabbath, but some of the early album covers are really terrible.
Oh, this is awful.
Including this.
It's awful.
The famous story, of course, was that the record was supposed to be called War Pigs.
Yep.
And the Paranoid single had already come out and been such a huge hit. Record company was like, no, you got to call the album Paranoid instead. War Pigs itself, though, the early version is on, is it the Ozman Cometh? The Walpurgis, Witch's Night version, which is cool to hear as a fan.
All these different lyrics,
even crazier lyrics than it's on the record. So that's something I always got a kick out of. Tom Allen from Priest, who we mentioned, came back to engineer this record, and he actually plays the piano on Planet Caravan.
Oh, it is him. Okay.
Which was something that I learned recently. And as a kid, I always got a kick out of I had the record. The Luke's Wall and Jack the Stripper, just these made up song titles that
for little segments that
Warner Brothers just made up arbitrarily. It's like, how could you do that to the artist?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, War Pig / Luke's Wall.
Right.
Most people are like, "What is Luke's Wall?"
Right.
It's, unless you're like looking at the back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting, but like a legendary album. And we both agree, a complete game changer for so many people.
Absolutely.
Myself included. So we're going to fast forward now to 1971, I believe, right?
July 21st, 1971.
That's right. The album Master of Reality. Again, a lot of people say that this was the birth of stoner rock or stoner metal, whatever the hell you want to call it.
Certainly Sweetleaf. I mean, God.
Probably heavier than Paranoid, I think, anyway.
Yeah, it's close. It could be, I mean.
But no less classic songs on here. You got Sweetleaf, After Forever.
Into the Void. Children of the Grave.
Lord of this World. And you got a couple, the little Orchid and Embryo instrumental ditties there. Just a bone-crunching heavy album.
Yeah, just an amazing record.
That,
to me, I know we're not rating records yet, but to me, the first 3 Sabbath records, which this was the last record produced by Roger Bain, the 3 of them are, to me, head and shoulders above the next 3. And I don't know if we're supposed to be saying that yet.
Okay.
But to me, it was like sort of the end of an era. You had these first 3, and then the next 3 are just to me, just a hair under. And they're different. And that's when the band, was, I guess, really, was Solitude and Planet Caravan, really trying to spread their wings a little bit and be a little different. But yeah, such a great record.
Yeah, great album. So by this time, Sabbath is huge. Okay, so they're headlining tours, and the kind of that era of excess starting to kind of seep in there a little bit. So before you know it, the guys are heavily involved in cocaine and alcohol and whatnot, just having a blast,
man.
Spending a lot of money, because this is back in the day where the record companies would give you heaps of money to record albums and go on tour. So they took full advantage of this.
And if we're talking just since we're talking the record, one thing I forgot to mention was the poster in Master Reality.
Oh, yeah.
The first pressing had a fold-out poster of the guys by a tree in the woods somewhere. It's not the greatest poster, but it's kind of cool to have if you're a collector. That's something to always look for in the early pressings. It took me years to find one.
I tell you, that's the whole thing with vinyl. Back in the day when you would go out and buy a record, you weren't just getting the LP and the jacket. You would have the lyrics and posters, and Kiss did all sorts of cool stuff.
Kiss,
Chicago, they would all this stuff. So it's like you bought a record, you were getting like a whole package full of shit. It was like really, really cool. So, all right. So as Chris mentioned, with the next album, a little bit more experimentation started to come into the music. At this time, this is 1972, I believe.
Yep.
Progressive rock is all the rage. So you got bands like Genesis and Yes and King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So, Sabbath started to kind of want to experiment a little bit too. So they went into the studio. Tony especially was really into writing some bigger, more adventurous and experimental music. And the result was Volume 4. Which I'm going to kind of go against what Chris said before.
I know it's one of your favorites.
And again, we're going to talk about this at the end, but this is my favorite Sabbath album of all time, and it has been for a long, long time. For me, there's just some songs on here that are absolutely timeless, and I like the variety on this album. Not that those albums don't have it. I don't know. For me, I just enjoyed this a little bit more.
I mean, it's a great record.
It's
an amazing record. It's the first time they recorded in Los Angeles. The first time they dumped the original producer, Roger Bain, they had Patrick Meehan, who was their manager at the time. Probably didn't know anything about producing, but they did it themselves, which meant it probably fell mostly on Tony Iommi to produce the record. So it's a little different sounding than the earlier records.
But it's got Snowblind.
Oh, great. I mean, Wheels of Confusion.
Wheels of Confusion, Tomorrow's Dream.
Right. Under the Sun, which they brought back the last couple of years to play live, which is such great. I mean, they really, Sabbath as a band, the last few years have been leaning more heavily again on drawing from Volume 4 to play live, which is great because it is such a great record.
It really is. And you had Changes, of course, which was something completely different for them.
Completely different.
Kind of like the sister.
I hate that song.
Oh, I never need to hear it again.
Yeah.
In fact, I think if you were to, I'm talking about this album and all the tracks. If you took Changes off this album and I never had to hear it again, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But I love the rest of it. Absolutely love the rest of it.
Yeah, me too. It's great.
And
and originally the vinyl was a gatefold, and when you opened it up, there was big picture of Tony was glued in.
Yep.
So yeah.
That's
which
right
they did reproduce.
That's the one right there.
In the record. And originally, the record was to be titled Snowblind. The record company put their foot down and said, no, you have to change the title. So they came up with Volume 4, which at the time, I guess, was kind of a goof. But now so many other bands have spoofed it. Of course, the other thing, you mentioned them getting into drugs and everything else. Yeah. The famous thanks to the Coca-Cola Company of America. The band really was heavily into cocaine.
Oh, big time, yeah.
That definitely did affect the band, but they still managed to come out with just an amazing record.
Amazing album.
They were 4 for 4 at the time.
Yeah, and it continued. Their next one, this is an album that for me, I think when I was younger and really into Sabbath, like in the early mid '80s, it took me a long time to really appreciate the greatness of this album. And Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is what year are we going to? 73, right? So basically an album a year, lots of touring.
Released December 1st, 1973.
Yep. And this is a different album. This is a much more melodic album. A lot of variety on here. You know, you've got the killer title track, which is a classic National Acrobat, Sabracadabra. Again, a little proggy in spots.
Definitely proggy. Killing Yourself to Live, one of my favorite Sabbath tracks, is on this record.
Who Are You, with its like Moog synthesizer, right?
Rick Wakeman from Yes.
Exactly.
Played keyboards.
Looking for Today and Spiral Architect. What a killer ending. What that is.
An amazing record. But again, Patrick Meehan got credit as co-producer, but again, I'm sure it was Tony who really was doing everything. And at this time, they had done the infamous jam session that Tony talks about in his book.
Yep.
Where the members of Zeppelin, who were friendly with Sabbath, came into the studio
across the hall, right? Yeah.
Yep. And John Bonham wanted to play on Sabracadabra, but instead they just jammed.
Yeah.
And of course the
Wouldn't
tape.
it be cool to hear that, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Now I forget. Did they play? Was it on for this album or the next album where they played the big show
California
Jam with Deep Purple?
I was going to mention that April 1st, 1974.
Yep.
Deep Purple, Black Sabbath.
Black Sabbath
Lake
in the middle of the day.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Was it Rare Earth and the Eagles?
The Eagles
and somebody else was like 250,000 people
or more. Yeah,
showed up at this the famous California Jam. The entire set from Deep Purple is on DVD, and a couple of the songs from Sabbath were shown on television.
Yep, you find them on
YouTube. And now they're on YouTube in color. In fact, when I was a kid, I had to buy a bootleg VHS that only had black and white. But yeah, I know Sabbath were somewhat down on themselves from their performance because they had actually ended the Sabbath Bloody Sabbath tour. They had off, I think, a couple weeks and then played the show without rehearsing. But I watched it again recently and I thought they sounded great. I really didn't. I didn't think
they all looked high as kites, but you know, I thought they were playing fine as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think they played a great set. It's interesting too to go back and watch because Tony Iommi is not in all black. He hadn't really started that yet. That really didn't come until...
They look like a bunch of California guys, right?
Yeah, that's it. Look like a bunch of California hippies hanging out. But they played a great set. Ozzy was doing his usual leapfrogs.
Oh, yeah.
The energy that they had was great.
Yeah. So they kind of continued this momentum. Again, more adventurous songwriting and production techniques are even coming into play even more in the next album, which is Sabotage, which for a lot of people, our friend Mr. Keeler himself, one of his favorite albums by the band. And another one of those albums that myself personally, it took me a long time to really appreciate this album. This is a really kind of demanding, it's one of those albums you need to stop and listen to. Again, this is not music just pop on in the back.
I would completely agree. I think Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage, they're not as accessible, I guess, as the first couple. You do really need to listen to them and delve into it. But yeah, great record. Again, we didn't mention the Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. What a great album cover. But boom, back to Sabotage. What a great album, great band, but what a stinker of an album cover. The famous story was that Bill Ward showed up without pants for the photo shoot.
I mean, look at those awful red pants, folks.
And he had to have his wife take her pants off and give it to Bill so he could put pants on. But, of course, how high do you have to be to get in a car and go to a photo studio not wearing pants?
Well, in Bill's case, he was probably drunk off his ass.
Yeah,
he was a complete alcoholic by this time.
That's true.
But, I mean, just look at this. You got Ozzy wearing some kind of like a woman's kimono. You got Tony wearing like a white jacket and like jeans, and Geezer actually looks okay, but this is just a terrible, terrible cover.
Terrible. Actually, the shot in the back I think is would have made a much better album cover.
But the songs, other than like Hole in the Sky and Symptom of the Universe, which were the heaviest tunes on this album, you had some really kind of wild music on here. Don't Start Too Late, Megalomania, Thrill of It All, Superstar,
the instrumental Superstar, which they used for years. The Writ, which was about their legal battles with their original manager, which just was really almost breaking apart the band because they were in such dire straits.
Yep.
So a very interesting record. Again, I love it, and to me, this was again these next three records were a hair below the first three for me, but certainly still above the next two.
But here, this is where the cracks are starting to show.
Yes, this is where the cracks are starting to show. One thing I had learned was that Mike Butcher was the co-producer with Tony, but Robin Black engineered the record, and Robin Black would show up later on to work on the Born Again record, which I was like, I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, certainly Sabotage the somewhat the end of an era of the
probably the last great Ozzy era album.
Yeah.
Not to discredit this next one, which I happen to like quite a bit. And Technical Ecstasy was what year was this? What are you at? 76?
This was released September 1976.
There we go. So Technical Ecstasy, another oddball cover. Two robots doing the nasty, I guess. There's all sorts of ways you can interpret it.
Hypnosis, who did lots of Floyd and
and they were known for that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it's just so funny how a bunch of these early Sabbath records just the album covers just didn't really match up with the music at all. But a decent album. Some really strong tunes on here. Overall, a big step down from the ones before, like we mentioned. But Backstreet Kids, pretty cool rocker. You Won't Change Me, I'm not going to say too much about that. It's All Right, I'm not going to say much about that. Gypsy's a great tune. All Moving Parts Stand Still, I kind of like. Rock and Roll Doctors, pretty cool rock tune, but again, not really Sabbathy.
No.
And in fact, I think
famously
Ozzy
covered, right? It's All Right was Bill Ward did the vocals, and Guns N' Roses covered it in the
one of those albums.
One of those records in the 90s.
But, for me, the best song on here is, and it's a song which they played live forever.
To this day,
is Dirty Women. I love that tune. And for my money, it's like that's such a great song. And I don't think there's really anything else on this album that quite measures up to that. Again, a decent enough album, but, and the remasters they did a couple of years ago, this is probably the best sounding one out of all the remasters. They really did a nice job on this, and Never Say Die, which is coming up next. But I very rarely listen to this album anymore.
I agree with everything you said. Again, Dirty Women is great. I always love hearing it live in concert whenever they would play it. But it's just not the quality of the earlier records. To me, it always, I know at the time, Tony Iommi really got into Queen and became very good. He was very good buddies with Brian May. To me, it always seemed like he was trying to make a Queen record. He was trying to have Sabbath make a Queen record. I know I read a quote recently where Geezer Butler said he called this record the beginning of the end of the greatness of the original band. At the time too, in press photos for this record, if I'm not mistaken, this is when Ozzy started to he made a t-shirt that said Blizzard of Oz, started talking about doing a solo record and a solo career. And it was.
Well, because behind the scenes, the band was just falling apart.
Yeah.
Besides for all the excess and addictions that were going on, Ozzy by this time was a handful. He was just a complete mess. And I don't think, nobody was really that happy with this record. They were all doing all this stuff and not getting along. So, basically Ozzy, left the band for a brief period of time. Yes, and then once they started to work on the next record, they actually showed up. And I would love to see the video. I have the audio. It's out there. Audio's on YouTube. Well, they got Dave Walker from Fleetwood Mac.
to do Junior's Eyes.
Yeah,
they showed up on TV with this guy to do this new song.
It sounds pretty good. I
don't know how he
well,
was.
He's a really good singer, but he would not have fit in this band, obviously.
But yeah, I think the song totally worked. And I know we didn't get to it yet, but that's the only song that I actually like off Never Say Die, which is the next record, which I will go on record saying it's my personal belief it's the worst Sabbath record in their catalog, counting everything. I hate this record.
It's tied for the worst with me with another record, which I'm sure you all know what we're talking about.
Pete's gonna read off the titles like Shockwave and Air Dance, and if he put a gun to my head right now and said sing Shockwave and Air Dance, he'd have to pull the trigger. To me, this Sabbath record, I have 6 copies of it at the house.
Yeah, you don't need any of them.
I never listen to any of them. I hate the title track. I think it's a
I actually
terrible
don't. I don't mind the title track, and a couple of the tunes are kind of passable. You know, Junior's Eyes, Johnny Blade. First of all, I think Ozzy sounds terrible on this album. I don't like the production on this album. It's not a heavy album by any means, and it's just to me, it's like Sabbath.
Terrible. I hate the guitar tone.
Yeah, the remaster sounds good though. If you haven't heard this remaster, it's actually the album sounds better here.
I'll have to listen to it because I have it, but have not listened to it.
The songs are still the same. That's the problem.
Right.
But this just sounds like Sabbath going through the motions. And, I know the 70s was winding down at this point, but, man, they just sound like dead on arrival here.
Terrible. Bill Ward does do the one vocal on Swinging the Chains, which, again, I had to look it up, but I remember him, but I don't know the song.
It's not a very good song. There's saxophone on a song on here.
They recorded the record in Canada. They was claimed they were all miserable doing the record. It took months to do it. Then they did their anniversary tour, and it's crazy because they toured for months before the record was released. But they had Van Halen, who were the new hot rock band on Warner Brothers opening up, and everybody who's seen it had said that was a great package, and everybody said Van Halen was awesome. I know I'm 99% sure Steve Keeler saw them on that tour, and
I think so.
I was like, oh man, that
Steve Keeler loves this album. I get into arguments with him all the time about this.
It's a terrible record. I hate that record. Don Airey does the keyboards.
That's right, yeah.
Which is interesting because he would later switch over to Ozzy for his solo stuff. But
I have to say the best thing about this album is probably the album cover. It's kind of interesting, Again, not a great album cover, but it's kind of mysterious looking.
Yeah,
so
I agree. What fascinates me too about the album cover is that since the reunion in '97, Sabbath have used this album cover on the merchandising.
Yeah, I own
for shirts, but yet as a
they don't play anything off
they
of it.
Never. In fact, no version of Black Sabbath ever played any song, as far as I know, off of Never Say Die after the Never Say Die tour. It was never played again. That's how much they hate the record.
Wow.
And Ozzy, as a solo artist, again, somebody could prove me wrong, but other than the two shows that he did for Speak of the Devil
with Brad Gillis,
with Brad Gillis, which he recorded for the live record, or Talk of the Devil if you're in England, when he did the title track Never Say Die, that was the only time he ever played anything off that record. So the guys in the band really either A, they know people don't like it, and also I would imagine B, themselves just really don't like that record.
Not going to get an argument from me on that.
Yeah.
So, by the time this tour was done, which, by the way, there is a DVD of a show from that tour, which is damn good.
It's a great show. The only thing that stinks about it is it's only 60 minutes of the show.
Yeah.
They used to do weird things with, videotape back then, and they don't have the whole set. But it is a fantastic show. It's on DVD, and it's one of the only almost complete Sabbath shows from that era that is available. And it's a great show.
So, of course, the 70s are over. Black Sabbath is pretty much finished, or so we thought. So Ozzy's gone, right? Ozzy goes off and forms Blizzard of Oz. Tony and Geezer and Bill decide to carry on, right? So, so what winds up happening? So there's this guy, this little New York singer by the name of Ronnie James Dio, who had fairly recently been with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow with a string of 3 pretty untouchable albums. Well, Ritchie decides to go in a different direction, so Ronnie leaves the band. He's kind of a free agent at the time. He winds up meeting up with Tony, I believe.
Which, if you remember the story, Sharon Arden, who was the daughter of Don Arden, Sabbath's manager, or previous manager, right? Because I think they'd already split at that time.
I think so, yeah.
Ran into Tony in California, said that he was looking for a singer, right? And was she already in the picture with Ozzy? But she recommended Ronnie James Dio, which is
weird,
crazy.
When you know the rest of the history that came after it, you would think, what? But so they get together, they do some hanging out, writing and whatnot, and a new version of Black Sabbath is born, for an album which completely revitalized the career of this band.
Game changer. Yep. Certainly songs were faster.
different production values, different feel,
different sound,
doom and gloom, and that kind of, I hate to keep using the stoner term, but that kind of followed a lot of Sabbath's earlier records, just completely gone. And at the time, the new wave of British heavy metal was kind of all the rage, so Sabbath kind of like jumped on that. I was
just going to say that, Pete. I mean, talk about the right record at the right time. This could compete with the Saxons and the Maidens and Def Leppard. Everybody was it was a new decade, and everybody, whether they knew it or not, the bands at least that really mattered back then, it was a new direction, and that was the way to go.
Yeah. So, 1980, Heaven and Hell. So, of course, you got Neon Nights, the title track, Children of the Sea, Lady Evil, Wishing Well, Die Young.
Such a great record.
Top to bottom.
Geezer Butler actually did leave while they were recording the record. And Craig Gruber from Elf came in and did apparently some of the demo bass tracks, but then Geezer did come back
and re-recorded
them.
But most of the lyrics here are written by
James Dio, which Geezer Butler said he was thrilled that Ronnie was a lyricist because he hated writing the lyrics.
Most people forget that Geezer wrote most of those lyrics back in the old days.
Absolutely, and you'll see on certain interviews, Ozzy will sort of take credit for writing those songs, but it's like, wait, you didn't write those words.
No, Ozzy probably came up with a little, he hummed some melodies and what happened.
Right.
So, but yeah, a totally different feel, a totally different band. Again, a shift to things like, dragons and fantasy and all that kind of stuff. And of course, Ronnie's vocals are night and day from Ozzy.
Right.
Ozzy, he is who he is, right? He's a legend. He's got a distinct vocal style. But this brought a real singer to the band.
It was just an amazing record. One of my all-time favorite records. And it worked. It was very, people forget too, it was hugely successful. Yeah. I mean, on that tour, the corresponding tour, which they did quite a few shows with Blue Oyster Cult. I mean, BOC and Sabbath, they headlined Nassau Coliseum, Madison Square Garden, the New Haven Coliseum. I mean, all these big arenas in the New York tri-state area. It's like, wow, that was, people forget, Ozzy and Sabbath was so big. Yeah, well, the Ronnie era did amazing business.
Yeah. The Black and Blue tour was well attended. Most fans thought it was a perfect match. Of course, behind the scenes, from what we understand, the bands did not get along.
Right, they did not get along.
But Ronnie talked a lot about how the first few months playing out live with Sabbath was a little tough because, again, Ozzy was a beloved figure.
Right.
It's not easy to replace someone of that caliber, right, who's such a legend. But he won over the Sabbath fans fairly quickly.
Yep.
I mean, by the time the next album came out and I saw them on that tour, it was as if Ronnie had been in the band for years.
Right.
It was just, so...
If I remember right, the tour, the Heaven and Hell tour started in April of 1980. I know I have a old bootleg tape at the house. And it was pretty much the same set that they would stick with. But I know you're absolutely right. Ronnie frequently said that it was a little bit of a tough time. But I remember him pinpointing Philadelphia. He said when they came to Philly, for whatever reason, the
tides turned.
Right? Like that was the show where like the tide really turned, and from then on it was smooth sailing. But yeah, what a great era for the band. I mean, I have the old Japanese VHS of the Black and Blue movie. I actually have the Black and Blue movie on 35 millimeter film.
I've never, other than some stuff on YouTube, I've never seen that. I would love to own that.
You've never seen the movie?
I've just seen clips on
oh my
on
God.
YouTube.
All right, we'll have to change that, Pete, because as a kid, I was obsessed with it. I even remember writing to the Dio fan club asking about it, and they wrote, they asked them about the Live Evil, which we'll get to in a bit, but they told me that, that movie came out, it was the Black and Blue, which is incorrect, but yeah, Black and Blue is it's great. And man, 1981, I was thinking like, wow, what an unbelievable year. They start off the year they get a gold record for Heaven and Hell.
Yep.
They're still touring in Europe for Heaven and Hell. They take a little break. While they're on break, the Black and Blue movie comes out in movie theaters in America and drive-ins. Then their new single, Mob Rules, is in the heavy metal movie.
That's right. Yep.
And then they come out with The next record, all within the Mob Rules, all within a year.
A year, yeah.
A calendar year. I mean, that's...
And the quality
and
of all this stuff was just...
Then they're back on the road.
Yeah.
With another 3 months of touring for the next record.
Yeah.
New stage show. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. The
I remember
speed.
it was crazy. And I remember sitting in the movie theater watching the heavy metal movie. And when the Mob Rules tune came on, I was like, holy crap, that's Sabbath.
Yeah.
And it was just so heavy and in your face. I was like, whoa. So, of course, let's just get to Mob Rules, right? So, a mighty successor to the Heaven and Hell record. And so similar, really, in a lot of ways that for most fans, I always lean to this one a little bit, but man, this one is so close behind it. It's like they're equally as good.
And we should talk to Martin Birch, who produced was Deep Purple producer. He produced for
Whitesnake,
Rainbow,
Maiden,
Blue Oyster Cult. Would eventually do all the classics for Maiden.
Yeah.
Came in for these 2 records and just did an unbelievable job. And I always said, again, somebody could probably maybe prove me wrong, but I think Martin Birch is the greatest metal producer of all time, just on the catalog of stuff he worked at. And
then he just stopped and he had enough. And it's just, I think metal is the worst for it because I think a great loss that he has decided not to produce anymore.
Unfortunately.
Legendary album. So, what do you got here? Turn Up the Night, Voodoo, Sign of the Southern Cross. Come on, it doesn't get much better than that. The Mob Rules, Country Girl, Slipping Away, Falling Off the Edge of the World, over and over. I mean, top to bottom, again, ridiculous quality. I actually saw them on this tour. It was my first time seeing Sabbath, and the poor Johnny Van Zant band had the opportunity to open the show, and they literally got booed off the stage after like 25 minutes. Wow. It was bad. I mean, I had never seen anything like this before. So this was, 82, right?
81,
82. So, I was just a kid. I was, 16 years old, barely 16. And I remember my friend's father drove us to the Meadowlands. It was at the Brendan Byrne Arena, and dropped us off. And the people out in the parking lot were like lighting up crosses on fire.
Wow.
Torching garbage cans. It was insane. Heavy drinking crowd. And my friend's father looked at us and looked at what was going on. And he did not want to leave us there.
Right.
He was like, what did I just do dropping these kids off here? But man, it was an intense show.
And was that the August 82?
Yeah.
Okay, yep. So that was the end of their run for the Mob Rules, and that was
incredible.
Were they? And this is a stupid question, Pete, but were they selling Live Evil merch yet on that tour?
No.
Okay.
Not that I remember. No. Not that I remember.
But yeah, that was my my all-time favorite record is the Mob Rules. Even though I saw that lineup 18 times, I didn't see that tour. Right? I didn't see that tour.
Chris and I often joke about it because he is very jealous.
And I have so many friends that saw that tour.
It's that time machine you want to hop in and go back, right?
Either time machine or I just have to somehow siphon Pete's memories. Pete and Steve Keeler and my buddy Tad and my buddy Daryl, just take everybody's memories, and then maybe I could, see the whole show. Because I'm just obsessed with that era of the band. I just love it.
Yep. So, speaking of Live Evil, so this is the live album that kind of commemorates that first incarnation of the Dio era Sabbath. By the time this album came out, that lineup basically was done already. There's all sorts of controversy going on about
January '83. I think it actually hit stores. It's crazy too to think. All right, well, if that lineup was done, I mean, I'm thrilled that this album came out. I love the album. I should have wrote my buddy Dez hand painted this on my my jacket.
I was kind of hoping you would have brought it.
I totally forgot. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that they would release a double live record knowing that this lineup was no longer in existence. But that could be looking back. Well, Warner Brothers just signed Ronnie James Dio to a solo album, so maybe that was hey, we have both bands now, which is kind of weird, right? If you think about it.
Yeah.
But I love the record. I know a lot of people don't like some of the sound, but I love it. I love the cover.
The song selection is great. Vinny sounds great on here. Vinny Appice, by the way, we haven't mentioned him yet, but he was the drummer on the Mob Rules album.
He came in
right at the end of the Heaven and Hell, right?
Yeah, I want to say October of 1980? So I think like about halfway through the Heaven and Hell cycle, he came through and became the drummer for Sabbath.
Yep. So it's a kind of an end of an era. So, Ronnie and Vinny leave, and Tony and Geezer are kind of left by themselves. Ozzy's doing his own thing at the time. Actually, when this came out, first of all, I was devastated when I heard that Dio had left the band. I was completely devastated. But what really kind of annoyed me is that Ozzy released the Speak of the Devil album right at the same time as this came out.
I think that he beat them to stores, I think
so.
Just slightly.
And most fans were really divided on what they liked better. And I had a really hard time accepting Ozzy's album at the time. I just thought it was not a very good idea for him to decide at that time, when Sabbath were kind of down in the dumps, to go and release an album of all Black Sabbath songs done live with his band.
Which was especially interesting because at the time he was only covering 2 or 3.
Yeah, he would do Iron Man and Paranoid
and Children of the Grave.
Yeah, Children of War Pigs or whatever, yeah. So.
Right, it was minimal. I mean, he claims the story was, which I guess is possible, the whole thing with Randy Rhoads passing away, and so it was a last-minute idea to do Sabbath covers rather than his own material. But yeah, the timing really is suspect that they both put out double live records. And, of course, they had the unofficial live record, Live at Last, which came out a year or 2 earlier.
Which is great.
Which is a great...
Warts and all,
yeah. Which is a great recording. But, in a short period of time, you had 3 different, Sabbath live records to pick from. But, yeah, I love this record. I used to just listen to it over and over again. Look at the pictures in the gatefold.
Yeah, gotta love
and
that.
On the... I believe it's during the extended version of Heaven and Hell where Ronnie addresses the audience and mentions that they're filming tonight for a movie, which is really interesting considering they just had a movie in movie theaters. The footage is some of the most sought after footage that was never released. When Sabbath released which we'll get to the Black Sabbath Dio Years compilation. My personal favorite moment as a journalist, I got to do 4 separate interviews with Tony Iommi, Ronnie James Dio, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice. I asked all 4 of them the status of the infamous Live Evil concert footage, which was never released, and the 4 of them gave me 4 different answers. Of course, I took Tony's with the most most authority, and he was like, "Oh yeah, we should put that out." He's like, "I have it." He also told me he has
what are you waiting for, dude?
Right, and why he doesn't do what Deep Purple has done, I have no idea.
Oh,
but man, I would like.
It'd be a nice tribute to Ronnie at this point, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd pay $1,000 for a DVD of them on the Live Evil tour.
Yeah.
Or Mob Rules tour, but there is footage on YouTube because somebody, I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I don't think I have.
Yeah. Somebody rescued some of the reels, and some of them are silent, and some of them have music, but it is pro shot footage shot on 16mm film of Sabbath on the Mob Rules tour. I think it was in, I want to say Dallas. But there's 20 minutes of it, and thankfully there is a guy that shot the entire show of Sabbath on the Heaven and Hell tour with an 8mm or 16mm camera, and that's on YouTube. Thankfully, this one guy then came back the following year and shot Sabbath on the Mob Rules tour.
Ugh.
And he's only got an hour's worth of footage, but again, thankfully, that's out there because even that, I always found interesting, Pete, that Sabbath shot music videos for Neon Nights and Die Young, but they didn't do anything for Mob Rules.
Yeah, that is correct.
I always thought that was very strange.
Yeah, now that you think about it, yeah.
Yeah. So the only footage that's out there is the bootleg footage from Hammersmith and the lost or recovered footage, but from the Mob Rules tour. But I don't think at this point, we'll ever see it. I know too, going back, I know it's a bit of a tangent here. But the Black and Blue movie was supposed to be released on DVD.
I'd love to see it.
Like in 2005 or so, there was a press release sent to Blabbermouth and everybody else, and then it was mysteriously pulled. And maybe it was a little later. Maybe it was, no, I think it was around there. 2004, 2005. I interviewed Ronnie. He was very angry about that. And he didn't name names, but he's like, I'm blaming them because they want to bury my version of the band. Of course, within a year or two, he was back in the band, but he was very disappointed. It's a shame that that movie never came out. It's a shame the footage of this never came out.
Well, hopefully someday. We'll see.
Yeah.
But a really good live album.
It's a great record.
For my money, I thought Dio did a great job on the early Ozzy tunes.
I would agree. I personally prefer, I know this is probably blasphemy, I prefer his version of NIB over Ozzy's, without question. Yeah, Iron Man, I never really liked his version of Iron Man or Black Sabbath, but everything else I thought was great. Particularly NIB, I really enjoyed.
NIB and War Pigs, because frankly, the reason why everybody, when they go to see Sabbath live
that's a great point.
When everybody does that part at the end, Dio started that. And Ozzy now, well, not anymore, but Ozzy has been doing it for all these years.
That's a great point. I have brought that up too, and people are like, no. And I'm like, yeah, go back and absolutely. Go back and listen to the earlier live recordings of Sabbath with Ronnie, and listen to Live at Last or some of the other bootleg live recordings of Sabbath with Ozzy in the 70s, and that never happened.
So the first Dio era ends. So with that, we're 50 minutes into the Sabbath thing here, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into a two-parter, because rather than have a 2-hour-long video. We're going to end it here, and then we're going to pick it right back up with the quick Ian Gillan era. So thanks for joining in. We'll see you shortly.